contributions to freshwater ecology by the Australian Society of Limnology, 2013. And very fortuitous for us is serving right now as a Fulbright scholar at Kansas State University, which we were able to convince him to take a 2.5-hour car ride rather than a 24-hour flight to get the seminar. So we're super excited to hear about forest, climate change, and of course, one of my favorite topics, streams. So without further ado, we'll hand it over.
Thank you. And control, that will work with you. Okay. I think you're good. Okay, and so
Getting the lights.
it's okay if I use a laser pointer rather than a mouse.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Zoom attendees.
That's good. It helps. Thank you.
Okay. And
If you switch them, and I'll turn on that out, like the small ones, that's for the big ones.
That's better, yeah.
there we go. Right. So that's me. I should over here. Sorry, I should go back. I need to do my acknowledgement of the country, if I may. In the spirit of reconciliation, the University of Tasmania respectfully acknowledges the lutruwita nations. The university also recognises the Aboriginal history and culture of the land and acknowledges and pays respect to the traditional owners and to elders past, present and emerging of the land on which all of the UTAS campuses stand and on which all this research I'll be talking about today has been conducted. I also like to acknowledge similarly the traditional owners of the state of Kansas, where I wrote most of the seminar. So there we go. So the more boring acknowledgements, not boring, but I do want to start off by acknowledging the organisations that over the past 25 years have sporadically funded the research that I'm going to be talking about today, and they've mostly, of course, not provided nearly enough funds, but I'm grateful for their contributions anyway. Forest Practices Authority has been my long-standing group with whom I'm collaborating on small streams and in Texas forestry. Forestry Tasmania, which now becomes Sustainable Timbers Tasmania, and the Warra Long-Term Ecological Research Area, which was originally started up by Forestry Tasmania. Australian Research Council, CRC for Forestry, Holsworth Wildlife Research Endowment, which funded some of the nutrient spiralling stuff, and the jaw-breaking national, something to do with climate change adaptation. Big shout out to Fulbright Commission Australia and Kansas State University, which is how come I'm here. Okay, as I spoke to the students over lunch, Fulbright is an excellent program, and you should be aware of the opportunities that present both academics and students to visit other countries and take advantage of the Senator Fulbright's vision for intercultural exchange. And there's a bunch of people there whose names probably don't mean very much to you, but who've either been graduate students or collaborators in those agencies to make this research possible. So, first up, a little bit of context for Australia. I realise that the University of Nebraska has been visiting Australia with some students for quite a while, so this might be teaching people how to suck eggs. But so there's the continent of Australia. These other lurid things, the administrative drainage basins, which are dreamt up by Geosciences Australia. And Tasmania is this little island down the bottom here. It's not Tanzania, okay? Even in 2022, somebody from the Bright group said, "Oh, Tasmania," and started trying to speak Swahili to me. Okay, so it's not a big place. It's about 0.32 of the Kansas. Okay, so I'm metric. I'm sorry. Maximum elevation 1,600 meters, which is just over 5,300 feet. The climate is cool, temperate, and maritime. So not a marked distinction between the seasons. We're just over, well, just shy of 600,000 people as of the last census. Yeah, we've got the convict heritage, which means that it's a fairly small tax base. I'm not making that because freshwater research, most of the money is spent in this thing, the Murray-Darling Basin. Okay, huge area, breadbasket of Australia, and now a basket case. I received no funding whatsoever from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And the tropics, where lots of politicians think that there's going to be rain in the future, or there is rain that is somehow wasted because it goes close to the sea. So Tasmania is often left off the list of funding priorities for freshwater research because it's not like the rest of the country. It's got real lakes, not just reservoirs, and it's got rivers that flow all year round. And Hydro Tasmania, featured prominently in the story in a moment, actually controls more freshwater than any other single agency in Australia. So we are wet, but only in one half of the state. Okay, so the intense rainfall gradient from the west through to the east. And so we're talking about more than 3 meters of rain around Queenstown here. And in this area here, we're between 300 and 200 millimeters of rain annually. So it's similar dryness to the Mediterranean plains in Adelaide or southwest Western Australia. And so it's an intense rain shadow gradient through. Geologically, there's also a divide in Tasmania, runs roughly from England, just so Devonport down through the southeast there. Over here, intensely metamorphosed quartzites, Precambrian stuff, very old, overlaid by peat soils. And so the freshwaters over here are dystrophic, highly coloured polyhumic waters, very, very low nutrient concentrations, so need very expensive chemistry to pick things up. And your mesotrophic here, this is mostly a Jurassic diorite in the centre of Tasmania, outcrops of granite up here, and a bit of basaltic stuff, which is intensely fertile, fought over by farmers. Competing interests. 42% of the land is in reserves of one sort or another. They're not all national parks. Some of them are what called forest reserves, which are isolated islands of interesting vegetation that are supposedly not going to be logged. The natural vegetation ranges from open grassy woodlands, which is common dry sclerophyll country through here, through to rainforests and wetland forests. Okay, so I hope that's. If you have any questions, please do. Next. Okay, so big landscapes. So Central Plateau, which is my happy place. And so that's the typical diorite country up here, diorite talus scree around the edge of the mountains, and these perched bog lakes, these are slightly mesotrophic, sitting on the diorite. This is the quartzite country, intensely oligotrophic lake at the bottom there. Southwest Tasmania, of course, is one of the largest remaining temperate wilderness areas in reserves in the world. Here's some tall, wet, short, wet alpine forest on the left here, and this is the Midlands, the first area to be extensively altered by invading European colonisers in the early 1800s. So grassy woodland being converted through to mostly improved pastures of one sort or another, and with the interesting European introductions to make the ponds feel happy, like hawthorn and willows and all that sort of stuff. Map of Tasmania. Oh, yeah, there's all the drainage basins, major drainage basins outlined in red. So the other big feature of Tasmania is that we have lots and lots and lots of little real lakes, not reservoirs, naturally occurring things. They've got freshwater most of the time, or nearly all the time. These two big bodies of water down here are hydro impoundments. Infamously, this is Lake Pedder, which kicked off the environmental movement properly in Australia back in the late 1970s and spawned the first Green Party anywhere in the world. That's another story which I'll yammer about afterwards if you want me to. But those are hydro storages, and in a Great Lake up here, which is Australia's largest freshwater lake by area and India's largest by volume. There's actually a series of lakes and wetlands that interconnect that got initially flooded by raising hydro raising dams in the late 1800s, and then there were another two raisings thereafter. So although clean and green, there's some issues there. And the other thing about, or background about Tasmania, aquatic biodiversity central. Okay, there's a picture of everyone's favourite crayfish, Astacopsis bulleye. Okay, isn't she beautiful? Next pod is the doyen of these beasts. More about the these animals than anybody else. Record of 6 kilos, over 80 centimetres long. That's sort of extrapolating from photos from an actual specimen. Yeah, so very long lived as far as we can tell. It takes them quite a long time to get to decent sizes. Galaxias are the main freshwater fish group. Okay, they're scaleless, scaleniform fish. There's 11 endemic species in Tasmania, plus a few extra which are found elsewhere in Australia and or New Zealand. There are numerous relic crustacean groups, Anascadacia, Tasmanian mountain shrimps, tree-tortoise isopods, lots of antipod genera found nowhere else, and lots of narrow-range endemic gastropods that take in hydroponic media. Every catchment across the north of the state's got different species. World's largest freshwater limpet, Ancylastrum carniangus, which you found rediscovered fairly recently. It's called 70 millimeters long. And interesting terrestrial stuff. And of course, Tasmanian devils, my wife works at Tasmanian devils. And so I'm enjoying the devil-free time. But to the meat of this presentation, what's a small headwater stream? When you scratch the tune, you find that people refer to the Kansas River as a headwater. The headwater of the Mississippi. It's all relative, right? Okay, so there's no simple definition that I can offer you, although John Goodrum and Peter Davies and I had a go with the notion of upstream heterogeneous zones. So the features that we're talking about, very small streams, they're not so small you can't drive a ute across it without noticing. That's the definition. The ute is like a pickup truck, but smaller. Okay, so very low velocities, mean velocities. You get these dyes of depositional zones next to erosional zones amongst the major bed forming materials, and under modal flows, these things don't get moved around very much at all. Really big flood to happen to affect the bed structure. Okay, so functionally, hill slope and colluvial processes dominate over the alluvial processes. They're incompetent to move their bed forming materials on the modal flows, and they're perennially or reliably seasonal. Okay, this is more of a thing that foresters were, and me initially, were interested in. I'm going to argue that we need to start thinking about seasonal streams because of climate change. Okay, so that's what. So generally, we're talking at a 1 in 25,000 mapping scale, zero water basin or source of the creek or stream, plus its first order and some second order tributaries. Talking 35 mapping scales as well, so get out a 1 in 1 million map in the first order streams, probably or a 10 streaming scale. Okay, the dominant harvesting system for most of the last century in tall wet eucalypt forests in Tasmania has been something called clear fell, burn and sow, or CBS for short. Okay, it's not pretty. And the harvesting happens in a small area of a catchment called a coop. It's a coop here, or part of a coop. MEZ stands for Machinery Exclusion Zone. I'll explain that in a moment. This is a senior ranking member of the governing body of the CRC for forestry, who moved on to other things, but I can't lost track of what he does now. So they start off life in old growth forest looking like that, and after a couple of years of regeneration, you get these regenerating eucalypts there. There's lots of timber in the stream and things like that. So the clear fell, burn and sow thing is done for the benefit of regeneration of the eucalypts. The eucalypts are basically fireweeds. They like a bit of a burn to give their babies a head start. One of the arguments the forest industry ran with was that basically the chronosequence of fire that you get after harvesting mimics what happens after a wildfire, as we get old growth there, and then after a few years after a fire, we've got some more open understory, but large trees have survived, and eventually we succeed back to an old growth forest with lots of old trees which have died and got tree hollows which accommodate all sorts of interesting mammalian fauna and birds and so forth. I'm not going to go into vegetation arguments about that, but because I was tasked with interested in the aquatic processes. All forest harvesting, all vegetation clearance actually in Tasmania takes place underneath the umbrella of the Forest Practices Code. This is its 4th iteration, 2020. It has been held up in the by notice people from the Yale University Forestry as an example of what can be done to regulate and mitigate the impacts of forest harvesting. So quite proud of being associated with this a number of years. So in small headwater streams, it's too hard to stop fire from getting into the riparian zone. So larger streams have got a riparian buffer, which gets bigger as you move downstream. But what happens in small headwater streams is we'll get what's called a machinery exclusion zone on MEZ. So you're not allowed to take your logging equipment into a zone 5 meters on either side of a 10-meter buffer across both banks. And so you can harvest occasional sawlog trees out of that zone, but you're not allowed to drive your machinery into it. Okay. And one thing that we were able to do in the last set of revisions going forward into the 2020 code was to identify wetlands and seeps in the coop and have those protected machinery exclusion zones as well. Having said that it's impossible to keep fire out of those zones, the forest practices officers, the people on the ground who actually implement the plans, take into the challenge to see what they can minimise the amount of burning. It's great to see. So that's some success there. Okay, so the riparian prescriptions are currently uniform across the island. Okay, but there are some local variations to accommodate safety. Okay, so chopping down trees is hazardous business. I think it has the highest injury rate, death rate of any of our primary industries. That's saying something because it's probably where a lot of farmers come to grief on their agricultural machinery. Sometimes zones made bigger or coops taken out of production to protect biodiversity values. It's not just aquatic things, including things like eagle nesting sites, other threatened species, snails and all that sort of soils, geoheritage, things like karst and caves, or particularly important geomorphological formations that people would like to see conserved in some way or another. So you get a very complicated jigsaw puzzle of mosaics across these landscapes in terms of what happens. So the impacts on headwater streams that we've documented are the short-term things mostly. So things that happen within a 20-year time frame of harvesting. And just a qualitative summary of the impacts that we've seen in our experiments and space-to-time surveys. Increase in light. Surprise! Temperature. Yes, it goes up, but not by much. Okay. Increased phosphorus uptake. Increase in the amount of woody debris in the creek. And I'm kind of one of the things that Ryan and I kept on sort of tuning that we should look into is charcoal, because you get a lot of charcoal in the streets. It's interesting whether that does something to the chemistry. I'm not much of a chemist, so I'll say that. Bacterial carbon production, increase in fine sediments but decreases in coarse sediments in recently harvested coops. And so we've got habitat contingent responses. We've got a general decrease in cellulose decomposition potential measured by cotton strips in coarse habitats, but not so in fine habitats. Dissolved organic, this is a surprise, the DOM sources were similar in harvested and old growth catchments. And we think that that's because catchment scale processes are more important harvesting practices in determining what's happening to the DOM signature. Hugely involved data set, that one, and quite a interesting, but not as complex a result as we were hoping to see. Okay, so there's the forestry story. I now want to talk about the climate change story, because Tasmania is next door to the third fastest warming patch of ocean off the east coast. The East Australian current is moving further south, so we will be finding Nemo in the future. But marine-wise, we've got central stephanus, some of the New South Wales starfish, which is supposedly wreaking havoc with some of our kelp forests. So a few years ago, under the aegis of NCAR, there we go, it's the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. It doesn't sort of exist anymore because it had abrupt sunset clauses and was actually run by some marine geomorphologists. So they grudgingly let some of the money bleed out in the freshwater world. Okay, so there's that our final report, which at the last minute they said, oh, we're turning this into a book, which then made it quite difficult, separate papers. Thank you. What can we expect under climate change? Well, it depends. Okay. And it depends on the model you pick. Now, to explain why this is important, you need to realise that in the global climate change models, the grid that everyone uses, Tasmania is on the junction of two grids, or it might be four grids. So the projections you get out of that stuff is local because of the edge effects of the modelling way that happens. And so our climate change oceanographers and climate scientists managed to scrunch some money out of the federal government and state government to do dynamic downscaling of the climate change models. So we've got more reasonable predictions as validated by backcasting or hindcasting than you've got out of the global models generally. And so they did an excellent job of getting temperature right. Rainfall, less so, runoff, less so again. Okay, and so some of the runoff stuff that has been generated from these models needs 40% bias correction. But we'll run as good as we can get, okay, for the time being. Here's a contrast between two extreme models. CSIRO Mark 3.5. Now, blue means decrease for some reason, and red means increase because that's what the temperature people like. So we have to do that for hydrology as well. Talk about changes in the mean base flow here. This model is saying we're getting quite massive changes in the declines in mean base flow in these regions. That's the decade before 2010. That's the recent thing compared to the long-term average through the 1950s to the 1990s. That's 2010 to 20. It's very unique, but anyway, we've got several decades. So I can move through those panels. Whereas the UK model is actually predicting some increases in mean base flow. So it's a little bit like those Sesame Street where we'll pass. Tomorrow will be cold and wet. This will be warm and sunny. So this is where I'm glad I'm not a policy wonk anymore. But how do you deal with that? Unfortunately, people are like, oh, we'll take the average. I think a different quantile might be better. If you want to be more cautious and go to the lower end of the quantiles or whatever. So limitations to that study, because we then mapped that hydrology onto, they wanted us to call them biodiversity assets. I hate that phrase, but there we go. And made some, some back of the envelope predictions about what was going to happen. But I want to focus actually more on the limitations of stuff so we don't get too taken by the pretty maps. Rainfall runoff models are geared towards modelling the yield for human users. That means it's biased towards the larger end of the catchment. Okay. And so of limited use for planning what might be happening or envisioning what might be happening for our small headwater streams. Forestry is mostly in headwater at higher elevations. European invasion, a criminal landscapes, surprise, surprise. Modelling low or cease to flow events is challenging, but that's really critical to understand what the flora and fauna is going to be doing. And if you look at the map there, you can say, oh, look at that big white area, which also extends to the north coast in a couple of places. That must mean there's no data because it's all reserved. No, it's hydro land, or as in hydro catchments or hydro managed catchments. And they use different rainfall runoff modeling things, focus on hydro yield. weren't able within our budget to reconcile those two modelling processes. So lucky to redo this. We've updated model predictions and have hydro in the tent as well. So we need modelling tools that are more oriented to pit level and sub-catchment scales, and that's what I'll be chatting more about at the moment. And some more flexible thinking about the role of perennial and living flows. Currently, the forestry code is geared towards things which are mostly perennial. Okay. And biodiversity data is both uneven and mostly modelled from sort of machine learning sorts of things. This thing called the conservation of freshwater ecosystem values did that at a fine scale across Tasmania. Marvelous job, but the modelling is now more than 15 years old. So definitely better data. Land use has, surprise, surprise, changed. So that stuff needs to be updated and maintained. But policy people just go back to what we wrote back in 2014. Okay, so my shopping list of things to think about. The small headwater streams and the forestry. I think there's gratuitous images to show the do science. Lucky stone fire. Eusphenia, spectaculus, appropriate name, dedicated to Tasmania. Flow permanence and water temperature, subsurface temperature scales and intermittent flows, hydrological changes from land use changes, geomorphic changes resulting from land use change and climate change, fire and anthropogenic adaptations. I'm thinking not just in the forestry space, but also in the agricultural space here. So, I mean, this last one is possibly the one that I find quite challenging, but also interesting in that, you know, climate change adaptation to a farmer means building dams and diverting water out of rivers and so forth, so the soil stays better for longer, etc., etc., etc. So there's going to be novel, there are already novel, much more farm ponds, nice sensible name, because Australia's called farm dams, it's the structure which creates the pond, right? In some irrigation landscapes, you're getting perennialisation of streams, things which used to be temporary and now uses water conduits and then flow longer and deeper than they used to, and knock-on effects from intensification of groundwater extraction. We're very embryonic in our stage of monitoring groundwater in Tasmania. We're not the Great Artesian Basin, so we don't have that background to us. Well, vegetation, and what does that do to the water supply? The infamous Zero curves, named after the man who first drew up what happens in tall, wet eucalypt forests in Victoria. And the original Zero curve is this blue solid line here. We've got time since harvesting or bushfires or whatever along here. And then we've got the annual change in water yield on that axis there. So as the baby trees get going, they start slurping water out of the soil, and you get a decrease in water yield, and that gradually attenuates and recovers back to pre-fire or pre-harvest conditions after a period of, we're talking about 150 years to get up here. Okay, there's 100 years there. Okay. Now, those other dotted lines are other models and other forest types or other predictions. So, although people generally grab Kazira's original paper and say this is what happens everywhere, it doesn't happen everywhere in quite the same way. It's been a challenge Australia-wide to get different vegetation types better included in these database. Get intense interaction with soil type, which can modify the curve a lot. May not apply to all forest types. Changing the forest age may be overwhelmed by regional changes in climate, because the climate change signals are coming through thick and fast, much faster than which is forecast back in the 2010s when those models were rerun. Back to the forestry situation. Soil compaction from machinery, exposure of the heel slope to erosion from intense precipitation events, roading and concrete design are critical to minimising sediment input. These are the things which are constantly brought into the code at the moment. Impacts on channel morphology depend on the soils and geology. Here's an example of a hill slope process embedding a stream. Okay, and that's a natural one. That's not from forestry itself. So there's challenges to untangle what's natural, what's not in the forest estate. It's difficult to untangle those natural events from forest-related landscapes and so forth. But there's going to be more of these things happening as climate change happens in Tasmania, because one of the features is not just a drying in some parts of Tasmania, it's going to get more frequent, more intense rainfall events. It's going to get more intense, particularly on the East Coast. All the models that agree on that part of the equation. But the real game changer, I think, is wildfire. Okay, wildfires will be more frequent and intense. We've got a lot of eucalypt forests in Tasmania, and so this is what happens with a wildfire. Before the wildfire, you have lovely big, live, living, old-growth trees and young growth researchers, and the fire goes through, the researcher series disappears, and that's what happens. So 2018, 2019 was Tasmania's summer of low, preceding the mainland one. The future arrives too soon. We weren't expecting these sorts of things to happen until late in this decade. Okay. Dry austral spring happened in 2018. Really extended dry spell in December, which also did wonderful things to Great Lake. That's another story. Had very dry vegetation in soils as we went into this into the summer. Two major dry lightning episodes. Okay, late December in 2018, it set off a bunch of ignitions. Some remote sensing was happened at the same time as the lightning strikes in January 2019. There are over 2,000 strikes that hit the ground in that episode, so there's a similar amount of activity happening in late December as well. More than 60 new fires were ignited as a result of that. The result was that nearly 3% of the area of the entire island burned. Okay, and that's the extent of the burn. The red bits are the extent of the burning, and the green bits are the major reserves. Mostly in the Southwest World Heritage Area and the southern forests. Southern forests are down here, and this is the Southwest World Heritage Area. Little rainforest or fire-sensitive alpine vegetation is affected. It just reinforce the fire boundaries that existed from previous things. Now, not sure you'll be able to see very much from this, but this is the Warra Long-Term Ecological Research Area where we've been doing most of our research. And before the fire, 2009, 2010, you can just make out, I hope, there's some little coops here. Here's an example of a coop, a new experimental way of doing the harvesting, where you leave islands of vegetation in the coop, aggregated retention. You probably see it a little bit better in the post-fire slide here. Lots of black bits, and there's the ag retention experiment plot for one of the ag retention spots there. There's a brand new coop there, which wasn't harvested there, or something so forth. But you can see there's substantial amounts of burnt vegetation here. That's the River fire. Okay, it was a cool fire. So did we get lucky? It's a cool fire because most of the adult trees survived. So what happens before and after shot from the water site? And real scientists prefer graphs. See photos, I'm sure. Okay, so what happened is that the overstory mostly survived, and overstory eucalyptus obliqua in those slides there. Yes, my stream bark, major sawwood timber as well as being ground up in chips, Japanese cardboard out of. Biomass of living trees, in tons per hectare on this axis here. Pre-fire, post-fire, not a lot of change, okay? But understory species like acacia and some of the other understory trees, dramatic reduction in those in a couple of those things here. And Dixonia antipa, which those tree ferns, so this slide, fairly fire resistant. So understory species are mostly killed. There's a flux tower in the Warra Long-Term Ecology. It's a big thing. Put a picture in the back. And before all the trunks were melted, we knew that this set of forests in this area were a carbon sink. When we got the flux tower going again, about a year after the fire went through, good data suggesting that now it's a carbon source. We also put fire. It may revert to a carbon sink if the understory regeneration happens uninterrupted. But if we're going to get more frequent fires in that, a while. So, in thinking through how forest practices prescriptions need to change to cope with climate change, the challenge that's thrown up to me earlier this year by FPA and part of this presentation for them, the conference they had recently with practitioners about how to deal with all this stuff. Here's some discharge data, back to some streams again. This is a number of different sites in different places. So I think this is it's from the drier forests in the east of the state. These sites here, so you've got cease to flow events, and this is all on a log scale on this axis here. And these are from another flow regime elsewhere in the state where you've got more perennial flow and it's a more seasonally less seasonally distinct compared to these dry sites. So we've got quite a range of hydrological types in our streams across the state. And bear in mind, less than 600,000 taxpayers and this quite a diverse island, so it is challenging to get across all this stuff. Up till now, as I mentioned earlier, the code is framed in terms of perennial streams. And I think it's fairly clear that intermittent streams are going to be more common in the forest estate in the foreseeable future. It's already happened, I think. Intermittent streams are common worldwide. There's not a lot of stats on that, but one paper says there's 58% of US forested land drains through intermittent streams. Riparian protection is rare. We've only got prescriptions to protect intermittent streams in Alaska and West Virginia. Now, there's a state that didn't get stepped by the before. Might say that. It's one of those cultural things I've learned to part of my Fulbright. Perennial streams will become more intermittent in places where it will get drier, and where the place I get drier is up for grabs in Tasmania. Flow may cease, but water may still be there, which means that the biodiversity may be able to cope quite happily with it. We just don't know. Residual pools and hyperic habitat. Two things that we haven't really sort of grappled with in the forest estate in Tasmania or elsewhere in Australia, other places. Biodiversity-wise, it may not be a disaster because some biota clearly specialise in streams, but the obligate aquatic species will struggle. We can move that. There's a nice little heap of streams, they're cute. You don't have to put waders on. Readily accessible. And just to demonstrate to all that I was actually reading some of these papers before I arrived. There is an intermittent stream riparian zone, and there is research in places like the US which is sort of taking that seriously. And drying and warming may accelerate things like decomposition, community metabolism, NP cycling, reduce downstream exports of nutrients and carbon. And so there might be a bit of an upside there for a state which is heavily dependent on coastal aquaculture activities. Rainfall events and re-wetting may stimulate retention of nutrients in the riparian zones. I like this phrase. I think it's a weather whiplash. You get those intense events. It takes a while for things to recover. Riparian buffers during those intense events often get bypassed. So you might need to think creatively about how rigid we are in enforcing those things, and increased transport of sediments and nutrients is going to be a result of those weather whiplash events. And so this current prescription system isn't really well set up for it. I don't think ecologists really set up for thinking through those things. So I offered this up in the government document a few years ago about, there's a simple conceptual model about how a small headwater stream might work, all the potential flows and all that sort of stuff. We're probably familiar with endless diagrams like this, and of course that during wet conditions or end of dry conditions, you might get different compartments contributing differentially less or more to the transport of materials downstream or for refuges and so forth. That's what's going over there, which is one when there's no data. So on to some thoughts about where solutions might lie in all this. Jackie Krog and Peter Hairstein from ANU were very keen on developing sub-catchment tools to try and keep the sediments on the coop. There's a win-win situation here. Stream ecologists don't want sediments in the stream. Salmon farmers don't want it down in the estuary, and the foresters would like the soils to stay on the soil. Yeah. And so, working with their forest industry in New South Wales, they came up with this notion of runoff source strengths, cross-classified with the amount of connectivity. And managing both those things together will do substantial wonders in mitigating the impacts of forestry activities on the transport of sediments and all the goods that come along with sediments to streams. So rather than one size fits all, you're going to have a 10-metre machinery exclusion zone no matter where, we might be able to come up with smarter prescriptions of digitating what actually happens on the coop surface itself and carefully managing drainage to achieve more sort of weather whiplash resistant solutions to these issues. Knowledge gaps impact of drought on soil strength unknown, as far as I know. Getting down to mapping things is a big issue, I think. LiDAR remote systems may help. I'll talk about that in a moment. We're not sure how repair and recovery is going to go after fire as things dry out. What we really need to think about, or what is going to be an effect, is there an effect of buffer intermittent streams? The only time they flow is during weather whiplash events, when repairing buffers are crossed anyway. I don't have all the answers, but I'm hoping that might prompt some people to have a think about things. But out there in the show, there are some catchment scale tools which people are developing. This is again from the US. It's great to come here. Catchment regional scale, modeling flow regimes, network and hydraulic connectivity. It varies seasonally, okay. And there are, as implied by this wonderful paper here, people out there coming to grips with how you would model how frequently the stream get connected, seasonal changes look like, and thereby, well, interested in salmon fish. I'm not modeling water temperature changes, effect on spawning, barriers and crossing between opportunities, creating refuge. This is a big one for Tasmania. We might want to re-barrier some of our streams to stop trout from invading habitat of vulnerable and threatened native freshwater species. So there could be some benefits from increasing intermittency. Mapping, I mentioned a moment ago, let's have a little cautionary tale about this. Some Swiss people working with a massive 13-hectare catchment decided to keep tabs on when the surface water was around in their streams. That's the dark blue bits of here. So during an extremely dry period, they went out, walked their catchment, and mapped in detail where the residual water was. There's a dry period, wetting up was happening as they pulled out of their dry period, and there's the complete network where it's completely wetted. But this is what gets represented on a topographic map. Oops. It's the thing that a forest practice officer, for example, might have to work with. Okay. So the cautionary tale is that there's a bunch of mostly dry drainage channels which become conduits into the stream during wetting events. Again, is the buffer strip prescription really sufficient to manage sediment inputs in those situations? It'd be great to do some more of this and do this in different vegetation, geological policies and so forth. Probably running over time, aren't I?
Oh, you've got a little bit.
I've got a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
So, aquatic refugia are going to be important. And that's something that Nick Bond and Sam Lake and Barbara Downs and other researchers on the mainland have exercised their minds over in drier catchments. And I think we're basically seeing that sort of habitat pattern translated into a forest situation. And what we can do to manage or protect those refugia is, I think, where we need to be devoting some of our attention. In terms of what is everyone else saying about climate change and forestry, with the disciplines that I interact with. So other things on the climate change and forestry agenda include changes to silvicultural systems, alternative harvesting systems, but TWF, tall wet forests, okay, riparian restoration and plantations. So some plantations were put in many booms ago, there's no native vegetation alongside the streams, and as they get harvested, prescriptions are putting, asking people to put native trees back in. Alternative tree species or use of things that were usually destined for pulp were now being repurposed as a soil type product, and interesting additional income stream for the forestry industry, carbon farming, sequestration of carbon. There's a lot of activity in that space. Hydrology. I think I've sort of covered most of those issues about understanding the variability and episodic nature of the flows. Skip down to geomorphology here. More extreme wetting events. That's the thing that's exciting their minds a lot because of those lances, the cast feature, and with accidentally pressing the wrong button. And some more extreme drying events are likely to impact soil carbon budgets and nutrient plants. Fire, I think, is the one which is the least certain of what that means and how we're going to manage fire in the forest state. There's a lot of forward planning happening in the World Heritage Area, protect those alpine systems and lots of sprinklers and wrapping things in foil. You're probably familiar with sorts of things. Clearly, we need to get more on the front foot with burning patterns which are consistent with climate change. We can't go back to 1788 or whatever it was. Okay, climate has changed sort of again, substantial language changes by the Europeans, and so David Bowman and others are bravely actively engaging with Indigenous communities to come up with fire regimes which will both respect Indigenous values and perceptions as well as accommodating what is going to be happening in our climate. That also includes alternatives to burning, in terms of slush removal, alternative silvicultural systems as well to reduce the fuel load. I call it leaf litter, they call it fuel because they walk around with big torches all the time. Okay, so summing up, the impacts are going to vary regionally, okay, even in Tasmania, particularly in Tasmania because of our topography. And so, what have we got here? I'll just to show you that different parts of the state are going to change in terms of these are severe runoff events, I think. My notes, but I don't want to. Functional change in number of cease to flow days, the other end of things. Cease to flow days, okay. Deepest red means that we're getting between 60 to 90% increase in the number of cease to flow days. Okay, and so you can see it's happening in a very patchy fashion across the state. In some places, we're not getting any change at all in cease to flow days. Other places, we're getting quite intense increases in those dry periods. Subcatchment scale intermittency is difficult to model because our modeling tools haven't really grappled with it, but I think there's some hope out there. And we probably need to think about management prescriptions which are flexible in different places in Tasmania to accommodate those likely outcomes. Inventory and mapping of aquatic refuges. Thus far, most people who've done that stuff have done it by foot. Okay. I don't know whether LiDAR and other remote sensing tools are going to be sensitive enough or somehow provide us with a cocktail of techniques so you can say, okay, these places definitely don't have refuges, these places have got to go and do some ground truthing. So love to talk to some remote sensing geographers who are focused on aquatic habitats. And the linkages, hillside processes, erosion, sediment delivery, geomorphology side of things is it's been unknown. Of course, hydrology, climate and land use changes. What people do with their land use, particularly in agricultural systems, is going to impinge on what happens in our streams. And by riparian impacts, this is the effects. I think that's me. So thank you for your attention and time. Without being too data light.
There's certainly time for questions.
Yes.
Can you kind of compare and contrast maybe headwater streams in these forested catchments compared to stuff we would see in the Great Plains, like grassland?
Yes. Okay. So that big review that I did with Joe Platcott and Amber Clark on small headwater streams of the Australian Water Commission. It's going back to 2010, I think, when we did that. The standout feature was that certainly in Australia, nobody looked at small headwater streams at all, really, in agricultural areas in Australia. It really was an unknown with much larger things. And so, but the other end of the spectrum, water dogs and others, concept area, people streams what they do in grassland areas. Providing contrasts in the Australian context is really difficult because there is so little data on those systems in ag areas. I spent a bit of time around some headwater streams in the Midlands. They're heavily altered because people remove the woody vegetation. Interestingly, there's even a patch of saline soil through the Midlands as well. So there's yet another bunch of interesting aquatic values, naturally saline wetlands and so forth. I'm not sure whether the streams in the ag areas of Tasmania become more intermittent as a result because woody vegetation has been removed. Okay. It's been interesting coming to Kansas where trees are the enemy, right? And woody vegetation is supposed to declines in 40 and so forth. Whereas in the Midlands and elsewhere in ag areas, people are desperately trying to get trees back in the landscape, and riparian zones are one of those bits which could be a good place to plant trees because wildlife values, pollinators, ecosystem services, but it's too difficult to farm or plough. So it's like there's an opportunity there. But whether that actually messes with the hydrology by putting the trees in or bigger trees than we used to have, I'm not sure we know that answer because most of the zero forest hydrology stuff has been in production forests and tall forests. That has been very little stuff done that we can run with the lands.
In your forest management study, where you did that the comparison between streams that had the trees knocked down versus not, I know you talked about the lower capacity of those streams to decompose like organically.
Yeah, anyone habitat.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you attribute any sort of mechanism to that, or did you notice or measure the difference?
Okay, we measure the difference. Kind of sort of I'm wondering whether we did get some differences in bacterial activity. We didn't have the available doing fungi time. So I'm wondering whether there are microbial changes as a result of because clearly after you get the burn going into the machine explosion or across the coop, first decent rainfall event, soil's probably a bit hydrophobic, you get fine sediments flushed into the stream. And my impression is they get flushed out of those streams fairly quickly. In contrast to lower down the catchment, this surface rockets goo underneath.
Yeah.
So you do get interstitial spaces and things like that. Now, we corrected our crop decomposition potential things for browsing by amphipods. Cool sample that's choosing quite happy. So I don't think it's a necessarily macro, but yeah, I think it's definitely micro. Most of the macro invertebrates in these particular streams, we're talking speciate polyphetes. Right. Words. No,
Oh, worms.
Yeah. Oh, what's that? Section. Okay, they are. We're talking about nematodes and tiny snails and stuff like that. So it's not the thing that sets an antagonistic forest like fire. Yeah.
I don't have any data to support this, but my personal observation of Tasmania in the last 2 decades is a tremendous growth in irrigated agriculture. Is that indeed true? So, what are some of the implications of your work is that projected to continue and increase, or is there policies to limit growth in irrigated agriculture?
Okay, so there's no, as far as I know, there's no plans to irrigate forests or tree crops. And so most irrigation is irrigation water is being used to establish multi-year or perennial horticultural crops. Cherries is the big one. Enormous sums of money to be made sending out-of-season cherries into Taiwan, Japan, and China when they were talking to us. Some vineyard stuff, but it's mostly crops like cherries, and I suspect that they'll start wrapping up some of the national fruit, apple, and palm fruit things as well. So most of the there's irrigation for dairy as well. Why you want to irrigate grass? We won't go there. That said, there are a couple of Midlands farmers who are using centre pivot irrigation to intensify pasture for sheep, chiefly meat lambs, with a view to revegetating or turning back some rest of their property, other parts of their property to native vegetation. That's an interesting trade-off there. One project I'm peripherally involved in and about to get more involved in is looking at the bits that can't get used by centre pivot irrigators and whether there are any biodiversity values to be had there, and we'll link those up with riparian corridors in restoration things. Where are we at with the irrigation schemes in Tasmania? I think there's about 3 or 4 more large ones, sort of notional plan, but pace has slowed down a little bit. Chiefly using hydro storage, allocating stuff into Macquarie in the Midlands and the northeast of the state. So water diversions out of the river to dairy pasture. The other big irrigation scheme is in the southeast near Hobart. Lettuces and you call them truck crops. There's an annual horticulture.
Well, it's 4:30, so I think if you have another question, we'll be happy to answer. Otherwise, let's begin.